Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday, I like to go over my best of one, best of three meta review. And Labor Day weekend, I was thinking I was going to have some more time to actually do this review, but I'm kind of running tight on my schedule. So I won't actually be able to get into best of three as much as I usually do, but we still have some good stuff to cover in best of one. And so what I do every week is I like to look at the data on Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, so it can kind of remove my bias, and we can just go off of the stats for what decks have been working for the most amount of people between Bronze and Mythic. So this week, for week 5, the new season of Bloomburrow, we can see Mono Red Aggro is still holding number 1. And if we compare it to the lists before, there are still no changes from week 3 of Bloomburrow. The overall strategy is to beat your opponent down with the Slick Shot Show Off, enabling it with the combat tricks of like Monstrous Rage and Might of the Meek, Demonic Ruckus. And you also have Mouse synergies. So Manifold Mouse can give you double strike on your Emberheart Challenger and your Heartfire Hero. And you also have the Shock and the Lightning Strike to disrupt other Mono Red Prowess builds and the Rakdos Aggro build. So we've seen this one around for some time, and it does quite well in best of one. It can be teched against, so it is weak against the single point interaction, like Get Lost, Lightning Helix, Go for the Throat, Cut Down to some extent, although sometimes you can kind of play around Cut Down. But yeah, this one being kind of the deck to beat and the most common one that you're going to bump into on the best of one ladder. Good news, too, is that they fixed the stupid bug here, so we shouldn't have any of the creeping orange throughout the review, which I'm very grateful for. So number 2 here is Selesnya Rabbits, and this one is kind of punishing. So as people tech against Mono Red Aggro and bring in a bunch of single point interaction, Selesnya Rabbits is good against that sort of strategy because of having multiple rectangles off of one card, like Hop to It, Sanguine Evangelist, the Offspring, just multiple things that require 2 removal for each card, etc. And so this one, we do see some changes actually happening from week 3 in this one, but it's all to do with the lands. So the core of the deck is largely figured out for best of one. General go wide strategy with the board, the Battle Cry off of Sanguine Evangelist, this getting bigger for each bunny that comes into play, so Hop to It giving this +3/+3 on turn 3. You can hit for an incredible amount of damage. Pop Hatch Recruit then makes it so that even more punishment for the single point interaction. The natural weakness to this deck, of course, is the board-centric wipes like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall, Deadly Cover-Up, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of what I mean by like when I talk about the rock, paper, scissors. So you've got like mono black hating on mono red aggro, but then you have the Selesnya Rabbits, which is harder for the mono black. So, but as far as the changes go, we see that they dropped the Brushlands and 1 Cavern of Souls, as well as a Razor Verge Thicket, and going for the much cheaper uncommon lands, which should be good for those who are on a budget, running the Blossoming Sands and the Creosote Heath, and just an additional plains. So good news if you are a budget player. The deck does still operate well with the budget lands, and potentially even better than with the pain lands, depending on how much you're coming up and racing that mono red aggro. Oh, and then also to mention, this deck can struggle a little bit against the early aggression of mono red aggro, since you are missing the Slick Shot interaction for the Slick Shot Show Off. I guess it's a little bit better against mono red aggro, a little bit worse against Rakdos Aggro, which we'll talk about here specifically coming up next. So number 3 is Rakdos Aggro. It's very similar to the mono red aggro, less so on the mice synergies. So last week in week 4, we saw them exploring the Manifold Mouse, which has been ditched here to bring back the 2 copies of the Emberheart Challenger. And this deck doesn't have the shocks and the Lightning Helix, or the Lightning Bolt, compared to mono red aggro. And but what you're gaining from that is a more consistent turn 3 win, where either through doing triple damage off of your Cacophony Scamps or your Heartfire Heroes, or flinging a Slick Shot Show Off, you can do an incredible amount of damage with the Calisel Sword, and just the red side, the Burn Together Adventure. So you do not necessarily need black. So if we compare this one to last week, what we can see is that they dropped the mouse and brought in the Emberheart Challenger. We also dropped 2 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire, and are leaning more towards 20 lands instead of 18. So there's a little bit of a debate about how low you can go, because of, especially like with the Manifold Mouse giving you that offspring, like you can kind of extend a little bit further. Personally, I think that like 18 can work. This time though, this is why I use the tracker to remove my bias, and we're going for 20 lands here, and we're dropping some of the black. So we're getting rid of the 3 copies of the Blackcleave Cliffs, which is the fast land for Rakdos or Black-Red, and then ditching 1 copy of the Sulphurous Springs, which is the Pain land, and then instead just running straight 6 basic mountains. So upping the land count to not get screwed as often. And I forgot to mention, I'll mention it really quickly here, the Rakdos Aggro deck is weak, similar to the same stuff that Mono Red Aggro is weak to. If they have instant speed interaction to blow up the Slick Shot Show Off, then you kind of have to play this cat and mouse game of like, when do you get the Slick Shot Show Off down? And Mono Black Skeletons is number 4, and we actually saw this peak yesterday. I think I saw it at number 1, just really at the early part of the beginning of the season. But this one is still no changes from week 3. This one kind of settled on the final build, favoring the Bloodletter of Akalazots over the Gisa, and ditching some of the crime synergies. And but the core of the deck is just skeleton synergies based off of the Corpses of the Lost, being able to give you that +1/+0 and haste, while also creating a creature that they have to answer. And this can be a problematic card for certain decks that lack the enchantment hate, where you can just keep bringing this back, and it can give you some late game reach. The Gix Yawgmoth Praetor is in here too, because they don't want to trade with your beefed up, 3/2 Forsaken Miner that you can bring back when you commit a crime. So they push damage fairly well, and works nicely with the Gix so that you don't kind of fall flat if your opponent does have enough interaction. Deep Cavern Bat also hates on your opponent's hand and gets rid of the interaction. And then we've got the cut downs and the go for the throats that make this particularly good at countering the Mono Red Aggro and the Rakdos Aggro. It's a little bit inherently weaker to the Selesnya Rabbits build, because as I mentioned, of the single point interaction. Number 5 is Boros Convoke, and similarly, still no changes from week 3. This deck was around before rotation, so it's really figured out. The only thing that we've got is the Hop to It. Again, similar to the Selesnya Rabbit strategy, this is punishing the single point interaction of Mono Black, and by going into a go wide strategy. It's called Boros Convoke, despite not actually having that much Convoke, because the whole deck is built around getting out a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, which you can do by blowing up an artifact with the Gleeful Demolition, with either the Ocean Frontliner, the Warden of the Novice Inspector, and we have seen some Jeskai where they're bringing in blue to be able to get the map token off of the 1/1 Siren Pirate, Spyglass Siren. And so that one has the downside of the mana inconsistencies, but has the upside of being able to kind of more accurately replace the Voldarian Epicure that we lost in rotation. Either way, this deck can get off to a very fast start. It does struggle against Selesnya Rabbits, which has an even faster pace. So I do think we're always going to see Boros Convoke kind of being in tier 2 compared to the Selesnya Rabbits, at least going forward until we get new tools for this archetype. But after you have played your turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, you can search your deck for a turn 3 Imidane's Recruiter, and then hit in for a ton of damage. Case of the Gateway Express here is the only interaction. Sometimes we see like a Get Lost or some sort of cheeky thing make it in here. The other thing too is War Leader's Call can help against the more controlling matchups, but we have not seen a lot of control on the ladder, so we're not having to deal with Sunfall and Temporary Lockdown as much as we did in the pre-rotation meta. So if you haven't given Boros Convoke a try after rotation, it's still doing strong. I was using it and it was doing the trick. So that's number 5. Number 6 here is Rakdos Lizards, and we've seen this one kind of pop in and out of the top 8. it does have some unfortunate matchups where it doesn't fare particularly well. But the deck is still also not. It's still in its infancy, especially with whether or not to run the Rockface villages and how much, and the Mudflat villages as well, because these help you against like Domain, which is more of an issue in best of 3, although you do bump into it occasionally in best of 1. Being able to give your creatures haste allows you to get in damage before they wipe the board with the Sunfalls. So this one is dropping the 2 copies of the Valley Flamecaller, which has the Lizard synergies, being able to have everything deal 1 more damage, and instead is bringing in some Deep Cavern Bat to help eliminate your opponent's interaction so that they can't disrupt the early tempo, because this deck really needs to be able to push damage early, otherwise it starts to pancake because of all of the cards that are needing you to be able to do that damage, right, to get your plus effect. And it doesn't necessarily get blocked up by like Selesnya Rabbits though, because of cards like the Vine Lasher and to some extent the Hired Claw that are able to get that damage through even if your opponent has kind of locked things down on the ground, and so you can still enable it. Flamecash Gecko allows this deck to explode on some turns where you damage them on turn 2 and then just dump your hand. I've had people do Flamecash Gecko, Gev on turn 2, and you're looking at like 4 cards on turn 2, and, and it can be pretty brutal if you don't have a temporary lockdown, which this deck struggles a little bit with as well, is the sweepers. It kind of depends on if you can get enough pressure in before. The other thing that we're bringing in is the 3 copies of the Thoughtstalker Warlock. We've seen this a lot in best of 3, so now we're starting to see it on the tracker in best of 1. This again allowing you to kind of hate on your opponent's interaction so that they can't snipe the key cards to enable your fast tempo. And the way to make room for this is we've dropped the cut downs from 4 to 2, so a little bit weaker against the turn 3 Rakdos Prowess. We've also dropped the 3 copies of Scales of Shale, which helped the deck race, at least in the mirror match, in my opinion. But just going for more creature-based threats instead of the interaction. And as far as lands go, we've dropped a mountain and 2 Rockface villages and a Sulphur Springs to bring in an additional Mudflat village, and which allows you to go a little bit further. So if they're doing non-exile-based wraths, so outside of the temporary lockdown and the Sunfalls, this allows you to bring back things if you're facing like black removal. And brought in 3 more swamps to reflect bringing in the Deep Cavern Bat and the Thoughtstalker Warlock. Gruul Aggro is number 7, and the Gruul Aggro, we actually haven't seen this in the top 8 yet in Bloomburrow. So the point of the Gruul Aggro build is to favor. It's very similar to the mono red aggro build or the Rakdos Prowess build, but instead you're bringing in green so that you can punish your opponent for the single point interaction. And so we see Gruul Aggro performing better in best of 3, where you need that, especially post sideboard, where they're going to bring in all of their interaction. So you usually see this as the like aggro deck in best of 1, or sorry, in best of 3. Still performs well in best of 1, especially the more that we're going to see people bringing in the single point interaction to counter the mono red aggro, right? Snakeskin Veil being the primary reason for that. You also have a little bit of dig through the questing druids, especially the Seek the Beast adventure allows you to dig further into your library. So that can help with additional reach. And then Innkeeper's Talent here for a little bit of exploring putting like a +1/+1 counter onto any of your mice threats that you're going to then give the double strike. Like, it's a really great enabler for the Valiant mechanic on the Heartfire hero. So I like that addition as well. You still have the shocks so that you can answer the Slickshot Show Off, but ditching the Lightning Strike for a little bit less direct burn. And you still have the Demonic Ruckus for being able to get around the go-wide strategies of Boros Convoke and Selesnya Rabbits, which can, especially with like the 2/2 Phanius in Rabbits and even the 1/1 flying off of the Sanguine Evangelist can be enough to swing a game. So being able to have the Demonic Ruckus to then bring in to give Menace to Slickshot Show Off has been a combo that I like. And because we're ditching the lightning strikes, we're going to bring in the Voldaren Thrillseeker to give a little bit of reach if our opponent is able to kind of shut down the strategy. We also have the Manland of the Restless Ridgeline, and we've got the Rockface Village for giving our mice haste, which is also a good way to not have a creature in hand to enable the Valiant. So I like where this is at, and I think it's a good best of one adaptation. I think it might be a little bit high on lands. If it's coming in from best of three, it's not uncommon for the lands to be a little bit on the high side. So just something that you might want to play around with is maybe dropping this, especially with the dig off of the Questing Druid. I feel like you can go even lower than what you usually see in the Rakdos Aggro, which is around 20. So if there was a deck that was going to run the 18, I think this archetype might be able to do it better. But you would want to get rid of the Restless Ridgelines, which would then hurt against certain matchups where the Manland is helpful to get around the Wraths. So just something to consider. And number 8 is Witch Domain, which is a way to say 4-color everything but red, which is the color of Atraxa is Witch. And so Witch Domain coming in here at number 8. We hadn't seen a top 8 by Witch Domain since week 2 of Bloomburrow, so it's a nice counteraction to the early aggression of mono red. Being able to have the instant speed interaction of Get Lost and Leyline Binding makes it pretty good for getting rid of the Slickshot show-offs. And then you have the temporary lockdowns and the Sunfalls for attacking the Selesnya Rabbits. The deck is usually weaker to Lazorius Control, which we have not seen in the top 8 since the beginning of rotation. And or maybe we have seen once, but we haven't seen it consistently. And it's also weak to the hand hate. So we haven't seen Mono Black Discard in the top 8 as well because it has some very poor matchups. This one is being one of the ones that the Up the Beanstalk can help you fight the hand hate, but generally this is weak to the Lilianas, the anything that's going in that path. And then it also is a little bit weak to the enchantment and artifact hate of like Destroy Evil is a really classic one that can hit Up the Beanstalk as well as Atraxa. So kind of depends on what your opponents are running for the tech. Usually see this more in best of 3. The general strategy though is disrupt your opponent until you slam down an Atraxa to give you the ability to do it all over again. And then the main win condition is Herd Migration, which is partly why. So like if they're able to answer the Atraxa and especially take advantage of milling your milling this deck can be weak because Atraxa pulls so much from your library. But if they have a Sunfall of their own, they just wait for you to play the Herd Migration and then they play the Sunfall. So one of the things to keep in mind is that if you are playing Domain and you come up against the mirror match, one of the things that's really handy is Jace. And Up the Beanstalk can actually be the deciding factor that ends up making you lose the game because it is a very grindy matchup where you're trading resources with your opponent. So we do see Jace make it in sometimes in best of 3, depending on how domain heavy the meta is. That being said, also for best of 3, we've seen we saw a huge surge of domain kind of subside because we brought in the natural counter, if you will, to domain, which is Dimir Midrange, which pressures the opponent, but then has the counterspell to prevent the reset button of the Sunfall. And so since we saw the change of Dimir coming in, we then saw a rise in Dimir Midrange, which was then countered by Rakdos Lizards, which is able to pressure the Dimir Midrange, and it struggles to keep up with that tempo where the counterspells don't matter as much. So we've seen this kind of rock, paper, scissors before in the best of 3 meta, and it's still here because Domain is still here, which I really thought Golgari Midrange was going to be the one that was going to have its spotlight in rotation because I thought Domain wasn't going to survive the Triomes rotating. But Domain basically trounces on Golgari Midrange, and so that's why we see a decrease in that. However, we've seen a huge spike in the aggro decks in best of 3, as we'll get into right now. So usually what I like to do is cover the top 3 winners of each best of 3 archetype, but I'm already supposed to be somewhere right now. So we're going to have to cut it a little bit short this week. I'll try to get back to doing the top 3 for each tournament. But what I like to use is the standard challenge on Moto, which is a very good tournament, has a lot of really good pro players and regulars in that tournament. And so this week we've got number 1 on the Friday, August 30th. was Rakdos Lizards by Guyote. Go with that. And so we've seen Rakdos Lizards, as I mentioned, kind of coming in to punish the Dimir midrange or Dimir aggro that was brought in to counter the domain. And so this week we still see a number 1 spot being taken down by Rakdos Lizards. Since I'm low on time, I'm just going to be covering the number 1s. Still, there are 4 tournaments to cover, so it's still a lot. What we see here, though, is we see a decrease in the Thoughtstalker Warlock, dropping this one from 4 copies down to 2, and dropping the 4 copies of the Lightning Strike, which was being run in this to give you a little bit of reach. And instead, we're bringing in the 2 copies of Cutdown and the 2 more copies of Go for the Throat. Again, I think really showcasing the switch in the meta from into a more aggro space. So we then need the interaction to slow them down if they're getting out of hand. Scales of Shale, then we saw that one in best of 1 and not in best of in best of 1 but not best of 3. Starting to see it here in best of 3, giving you that if you're since Rakdos Lizards is now more popular of a pick because of the counter to Dimir midrange, the commonality of bumping the chances of bumping into a Rakdos Lizards matchup is much higher. And then again, the Scales of Shale really helps tip the mirror match. And so I like it there. And I do think that, moving some of it into the sideboard is a pretty good option. So we see the Cutdowns and the Go for the Throats being removed from the sideboard, brought into the main, anticipating an aggro matchup. We also see Thoughtstalker Warlock being added to the sideboard instead of in the main, which I really like, which because like if you're up against an aggro matchup, attacking their hand isn't as important, whereas like the hand hate is really nice if you're coming up against more grindy matchups like Domain. So then Thoughtstalker Warlock, you would bring that in if it's more of a mid-range or control matchup. And we've also got 1 Bitter Triumph, which allows us to have a little bit of Planeswalker hate. Well, we're not seeing a huge amount of Planeswalkers outside of the Golgari midrange running the Liliana. Azorius is still kind of taking a side. And then 2 copies of Scales of Shale on the side. And again, this one I think is nice because if they are wiping all of your lizards and you're up against control, you really don't want 4 copies of Scales of Shale. But if you're in an aggro matchup where you're trying to race your opponent, then you definitely want the 4 copies of the Scales of Shale. So being able to give you that flexibility. We still also have the Duress to hate against the control and interaction heavy decks, and the Urbrask's Forge for specifically against like mono black really struggles against the artifact unless they can hit it with the Duress. So this one kind of giving you an edge in those matchups as well, that for the more grindy matchups. Glistening Deluge is also in here for the go wide strategies, which isn't usually Selesnya Rabbits in best of 3. It tends to be more of Azorius Convoke, or it's kind of like Azorius tokens, which we've covered in weeks in the past. Number 1 on Saturday, because there's 2 tournaments on Saturday. So the first place was taken down by Boros Convoke by Danny Starchild. And if we compare this one to the week 3, which was the last time that was in the top 3, we can see that they dropped the 1 Skrelv Defector Might to bring in the Sanguine Evangelist. So less single point interaction, preferring to have the additional threat on the board. And we also got rid of the 2 Get Losts and the Tokashi is Welcome, which was a little bit more of that like mid-range, worse against aggro, and brought in the 3 copies of the War Leader's Call, which usually we see the Get Losts when there's more aggro. And so the War Leader's Call here was then to help against more of the control matchups. So not a totally clear signal about the gratuitous amount of aggro that we're seeing, but sometimes you see this like fluctuation where like Friday there was a whole bunch of aggro, and then so on Saturday then there's more control to counter that, and then the War Leader's Call is well positioned. But generally War Leader's Call is favorable outside of the aggro matchups and more against the mid-range and control matchups. And as far as the lands go, we dropped 2 copies of the Cavern of Souls and the Fountain Port, and instead are just running the straight basics, bringing in 1 mountain and 2 plains. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we also got rid of the Get Losts in the sideboard, so getting rid of that match or that lineup entirely. And that might have to do with how much domain we were seeing in the tournament, because the Destroy Evil works quite a bit better than the Get Lost. And so we're dropping the Get Lost, we're dropping the Requisition Raid, which is also an artifact enchantment hate, better against the Rakdos Forge kind of thing. Invasion of Gobakon we dropped from 4 copies down to 3, this one being a pretty good one for either non-exiling Wraths or hand disruption for tempo plays. I like disrupting Gix in Dimir midrange, for example, on turn 3. And bringing in the 4th copy of the Rakdos Forge, again, to help against those grindier matchups. And the Destroy Evil works particularly well against Domain, so maybe we saw Domain spike to counter the aggro. If we saw a dip in Dimir midrange because of the spike in aggro, Destroy Evil works better against the Domain matchup than it does against the Dimir midrange, and allows you to hit up the Beanstalk as well as answer Atraxa. And it's also toughness, so it also hits the Archangel of Wrath. All right, now we're on to the second tournament in Saturday, which was taken down by what I'll call Orzhov Discard, because that was the name that I gave it before. And some people are calling this one Feyblade, which I kind of like. It's like Beyblade, but yeah, Feyblade. And so this one's Orzhov Discard by Cabeza de Bolo. Amazing name, by the way. Love that name. Every time I say it, always makes me happy. And so this one was number 1 on the second tournament, and this one's a new archetype. So Orzhov Discard isn't entirely new, but it's the first time that we're talking about it in the Bloomburrow specific meta post-rotation. And what we see is we kind of see a combining. So Cabeza de Bolo, I think in week 1, or maybe it was week 2, was exploring Orzhov midrange and some of the fun stuff that you could do with the Guardian of Girapur, right? And so they've definitely been tweaking this archetype for a little bit, and they've settled kind of on a mixture between what we've seen before in the Orzhov Discard space and bringing in some mid-range stuff. So really quickly though, like the fairy, the reason the Fey and the Feyblade is built off of the Nurturing Pixie, which allows you to bounce your permanents and play them again, which is particularly good with the interesting ETBs of like Tithing Blade, Hopeless Nightmare, and Carrot Cake. So Carrot Cake that we got in Bloomburrow, I think, fits nicely into that bouncing strategy. Guardian of Girapur then leads even further into that, being able to blink a creature or artifact that you control, getting additional ETBs. The ETB of Zoraline, as well as the Ruthless Lawbringer, works as well. We've got Lauren of the Third Path, which can blink to give you some artifact and enchantment hate. Beza can be blink it for gaining a whole bunch of life, and you can't do it with the Girapur. Oh no, you can't. Sorry. Blinking the Beza, the Bounding Spring. For some reason, I thought it was 3 or less. Braids. Every time that you're sacrificing their fodder of like Hopeless Nightmare, the 1/1 tokens, the tokens off of the Clue token, like this has a lot of stuff that is generated by those ETBs that you can then turn into value through Braids. Which is Vanity, then also giving you some more of that fodder, as well as being able to destroy some of the early stuff for the early aggression. Dirge, being able to bring stuff back from your library, or back from your graveyard, as well as tutor for something specific. And then the best of 3 sideboard is, I think, pretty fully loaded. So we've got the Bandit's Talent if we're up against an archetype that really struggles against the discard. So like anything that like Domain, right? Anything that struggles to kind of reliably draw cards, then you bring this in and it gives you kind of that inevitability. Lauren of the Third Path if we're coming up against Rakdos Forge or problematic enchantments. Malicious Eclipse for the Azorius tokens or the go wide strategies. Spring-loaded Sawblades for the Gruul Aggro, Dimir midrange, like anything requiring some instant speed interaction. Spring-loaded Sawblades you can flash in, and then also gives you something to then sacrifice to Braids later or Blink. Sarah Paragon gives you a little bit of like, if they're destroying your board but not exiling everything, then Sarah Paragon can let you play things back from the graveyard. Hostile Investigator, again, leaning more heavily into the discard, better against the mid-range and control matchups. And then Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, can silence the ETBs, so it stops Atraxa, it stops the Boros Convoke, anything that's relying on an ETB. The mirror match, where maybe you'd bump into the Orzhov discard strategy, being able to silence theirs and make yours double trigger, works particularly well in depending on the matchup. And last but not least, the other first place winner was Mono Red Prowess by Dagon 1. And we haven't seen Mono Red aggro in the top three since rotation, and we knew it was only a matter of time, right? Especially as we saw more aggro start to come in to the meta in best of three. And so this one is similar to the one that you see in best of one with some slight variations. So not running a full playset of the Lightning Strike. Rin's Resolve gives you a little bit deeper dig, and sometimes you see this in best of one as well. But usually you don't have to extend as much into the late game in best of one as you might have to in best of three. This one running the Scorching Shot, which sometimes we see Witchstalker Frenzy, kind of just depends on what problematic blocker you're trying to remove. But we then have the prowess that we saw before of like Slick Shot Show Off, Swift Spears, the mouse synergies of Manifold Mouse, and the Heartfire Hero, and the we're not and the Emberheart Challenger. The card that we don't usually see is the Hired Claw, and I kind of like this one because this one can just get out of control, right? And it hits your opponent pretty hard, so it's a pretty decent one drop, kind of as an alternative to like Phoenix Chick in the past, right? Just some way to like chip in some cheap damage. I think most of the time you're not going to actually be pumping this, but yeah, gives you an option, right? And the best of three sideboard, we've got additional Scorching Shots if you're running against like Golgari mid-range and you need to keep blowing up their Glissa Sunslayers and such. Urbesk's Forge, also good for the decks that struggle against the artifacts, and so the mid-range control, specifically in black, Urbesk's Forge is particularly nice to bring in for that matchup. Tectonic Hazard is in here for answering Boros Convoke and Azorius Convoke, any of the early token generator decks. Caught in the Crossfire is a new one. So this one we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and it deals 2 damage to each outlaw creature or 2 damage to each non-outlaw creature, or you can pay 4 to do both. And so this giving you kind of a specific way to wrath the board. And it can be really nice to move around your own threats, right? So giving us an alternative to just running more of the Tectonic Hazards, and is particularly good, I should mention as well, if they're running the War Leader's Call, right? So if the Boros Convoke strategy is able to give everything +1/+1, you need to be able to do 2 damage to everything instead of just 1. So sometimes we see that matter, especially in the Black Wraths. And then Case of the Crimson Pulse is one that we see as like usually in Gruul Aggro, as a way to kind of extend the dig. So if the game's going longer and you're not up against aggro, then you can bring in the Case of the Crimson Pulse to kind of extend into the mid-range. And then the Sunspine Links we got in Outlaws, or in Bloomburrow, and this one prevents players from gaining life. So if they have Carrot Cake, if they have a way to kind of extend Lightning Helix, get out of the reach of your deck, because this deck is really just trying to calculate how do I hit 20 damage as fast as I can, right? So life gain can be a real problem for that. You can bring the Sunspine Links in, and then some people were exploring this as a hate on Domain as well, because it deals damage equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. So the more that you're exploring into a 3-color, 4-color space, the more damage that the Sunspine Links can then do. So thanks for listening to my ramblings. Sorry I wasn't able to go more in-depth in best of 3. I usually like to do at least 8 or 9. Again, had to kind of cut things a little short this week. So hopefully, we didn't miss out on too much. I tried, at least we talked about Mono Red and the Orzhov Discard and like some of the new archetypes. The other ones, we might miss a couple of tweaks this week, but all in all, I think it's all going to be okay. So tomorrow I'll be doing my best to do the community deck techs. I won't be able to cover them all because we got too many this week, I think, but I'll do my best. And then I've got my Arena Open video coming out on Wednesday and some draft videos after that, and then it'll be back into the weekend and all, rinse and repeat. Meta breakers on Sundays, doing some off-meta picks in the new season, and be doing a gameplay video, ideally on Saturday, for whatever wins on the community poll from last Sunday's meta breakers. So hope that gives you a good idea if you're new to Magic the Gathering or returning after a long time. I know a lot of my viewers are in those two categories. Personally, I like to watch the small tweaks throughout the weeks because I think you can learn interesting signals about the meta and kind of what to bring or what people are doing. And so, let me know in the comments below if you found it helpful. It always makes my day to hear those comments. So take care, everybody, and I will see you all tomorrow.